Welcome to the Passion for Patients podcast. I'm Tonya Winders, the President and CEO of the Global Allergy and Airways Patient Platform, or GAAPP for short. We're excited you've chosen to join us today. GAAPP is 130 organizations from all across the globe who have one common mission to ensure that patients living with atopic, allergic, and airways diseases live better and breathe better. On this podcast, we are so excited to welcome our guest today, Dr. Ruth Tal-Singer, our Chief Scientific Officer. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Glad to be here.
Well, we are going to turn the focus to talking about engaging in research and what are clinical trials, while we need clinical trials. But before we do that, I want the audience to get to know you a little bit. So tell us kind of how you got involved in this work and how you became a passionate patient advocate.
Thank you. So I'll start from the beginning. I see myself as a patient advocate and a clinical research scientist. I have over 30 years of experience in research and development experience that led to the delivery of drugs that are currently approved medicine for patients. So that means a lot to me. I'm very proud of that. I started my career in healthcare as a military nurse. I was in critical care, and that was my focus, is respiratory diseases. And while caring for a young child with cancer who had a viral respiratory infection, this led to a lifelong fascination with the impact of viral infections and what they do to the body and how the body interacts with them and the importance of the immune system. So I pursued my doctorate in molecular virology at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And then I spent almost 23 years at a pharmaceutical company working on the development of medicines for infectious diseases, but also for lung diseases. I led many international collaborations that brought together industry, patient advocacy group, governments, and academic researchers, all working together with the aim to improve the understanding of lung diseases and improved care delivery. In 2019, I retired from industry and joined a nonprofit sector as a patient advocate, first as president and CEO of a US-based COPD foundation, a member of GAAPP. And since 2023, I joined GAAPP as Chief Scientific Officer to really broaden the global work that we're doing, partnering multiple patient advocacy organizations. As a researcher and a caregiver for family members with lung diseases, I see disease prevention and the development of better treatments as a life mission and my personal calling. So that's who I am.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ruth, for sharing a little bit about your background. I think it's important that our audience and our member organizations really get to know our team, and especially you as you're leading that research mission area. It's changed and evolved so much over really the last year or two under your leadership. So let's dive in to talk about clinical research. Why do we even need clinical research?
Thank you. It's a great question. And one thing that I wanted to talk about is the problem that we're trying to solve. So in 2015, there was research that looked at the 10 most commonly prescribed drugs in the United States. And what they found out is for every one patient that was treated successfully, either 3 or up to 24 patient conditions did not improve. So when you think about it, that you need to dose 25 people and only one of them would benefit from a medicine. It was injectable medicines, inhaled medicines, as well as oral drugs for a number of conditions. It's very expensive, but also very costly for the patient and the world to continue prescribing medicines that way. So what I wanted to talk about is precision medicine, where precision medicine is giving the right medicine for the right patient at the right time and at the right dose, which is also very, very important. As we think about diversity in clinical trials, it's important to remember that not everybody needs the same dose. So precision medicine, the definition of it is using either genetic or other information like a blood test or a biomarker to tailor a treatment plan to a specific subgroup of patients. So not everybody would benefit with one disease. When we look at personalized medicine, then we think about socioeconomic status, access to healthcare, in addition to genomic or any scientific data, is really thinking about where the person lives, what the preference is, what's the environment that impacts their health. And that's personalized medicine as a shared decision-making between provider and patient. So one thing that I hope you take as a message, a lot of time we talk about the cost of medications. And the process of discovering a medicine or discovering a drug is very long and very expensive. It takes about 15 to 20 years to get to the clinic. And if you look at the stages of discovery, it starts with drug discovery in a laboratory, about 10,000 different compounds that are screened in tests. Then about 250 candidates move to preclinical development, which could be human tissue, human organoids, or cultured cells, or animals. So that's about 250 candidates. Then we go to clinical trials, and usually you test about 5 different candidates to see which one is the best one or the most useful and easier to produce in terms of access. So that's about 5 of them. And then that goes through regulatory review, a lot of testing, and a lot of development. It takes multiple years to get to the launch of the drug. The one drug that gets to the clinic starts with about 10,000 compounds.
1 in 10,000.
Yeah.
I think we should stop there for just a minute, because that is, I think, again, being a patient advocate and being in the field and thinking about all the products that have come to market in respiratory and in atopic conditions, to think 1 in 10,000 actually make it to market, and all the investment that goes into that,
1.5 billion
that is
or more.
Incredible, right?
It is incredible.
So what is clinical research? I mean, at its foundation, at its basis, what is it?
Yeah. So clinical means it involves people. So just so people understand, this is research that focuses on people, and we're looking at new ways to prevent, detect, or treat disease. It could be a new drug, like I mentioned, those compounds that get screened. It could be new ways of doing surgery or new medical devices that are getting tested. New ways to use existing drugs for different patient populations. And we know a lot of drugs have been repurposed from one disease to another. So that is clinical research. And also new ways to change our behavior. In respiratory, we talk all about pulmonary rehabilitation. That's a way to improve health, and testing different ways to improve the behavior and change the behavior of someone to improve their quality of life and of people with either an acute illness or a chronic illness.
So Ruth, why don't you tell us a little bit about the different types of research?
Okay, so there are 4 different types that I'll describe. There's epidemiology research, which improves the understanding of a disease by looking at different patterns or causes and effects of health and disease in specific groups. That's epidemiology. There's behavioral research, which improves the understanding of how human behavior relates to their health and disease. Mm-hmm. There are health services. We always try to improve access to healthcare, optimizing healthcare, and looking at how healthcare providers or health services perform, how much does it cost, what happens to patients as a result of the care. So that's health services research. And then finally, there are clinical trials, which evaluate the effect of an intervention on health outcomes. So if you give someone a medicine or a device or surgery, what happens to them? One thing, if people leave with one thing in mind, is the importance of volunteering. Without volunteer, none of this can be done. And volunteering helps researchers learn more about disease and improve healthcare for people in the future. Another aspect, so we talked about volunteering and we talked about types of clinical trials. We could divide clinical trials or clinical research to interventional studies and observational studies. Interventional studies are looking at the effect of drugs, a pill, a patch, or an inhaler, or an injection. Medical devices could be an oxygen monitor that you look at. Different treatments like behavioral treatment or pulmonary rehabilitation. And those are often controlled as placebo-controlled trials where sometimes a normal treatment is stopped, sometimes it's on top of the normal treatment. So those are interventional studies. And one thing to remember, those are placebo-controlled randomized clinical trials. The second type is observational studies where you track health or other outcomes, could be surgery, worsening of disease over time. It could be a survey. It could be taking one blood sample or looking at health records without the patient being involved at all, just consenting to sharing health records. There's no placebo in those studies. There's no change in normal treatment. And basically, these are just observational studies. So it is important to look intervention versus observation.
So when we're talking about new treatments, we've had a ton of new treatments come forth in especially respiratory over the last several years. What are the stages that a new treatment goes through in order to get that approval and to enter the market?
So there are different phases of drug development. Phase 1 is usually short studies, about 1 month or even less. It's in about 10 to 20 people. And the reason to do phase 1 studies is to ask, is it safe? Usually it's in healthy people. Sometimes it isn't. How does the body process a drug or a medicine? And what are the side effects from the drug? That is phase 1. Once progressing to phase 2, the duration of phase 2 studies is about 3 to 12 months. The number of people involved are about 50, but could be up to 600 people, depending on the medicine that's being tested. The questions asked in phase 2 are, is it safe in patients? Does it work? How much should be taken? What is the dose? This is where you decide what dose should progress in development to phase 3. Phase 3 studies are usually much, much larger. Their duration is about 12 to 36 months. Usually there are 2 phase 3 trials for every drug that gets tested. The number of people ranges from 300, or we saw vaccine trials that are about 10,000 or 12,000 people around the world for diversity. And the questions in those studies, in phase 3 studies, or they're often called registration trials, is it safe in patient? Does it work well? What is the efficacy of the drug? Does the benefit outweigh the risk? Because that's when you're starting to look at a very large, diverse population, looking at, based on the outcome of the study, you're looking, is it safe? Is it well tolerated? But also, is it worth, even if there are side effects, if it's worth doing the intervention? Phase 4 happens after launch. So once a drug is approved by regulators, goes to market, now we're starting to look for about 3 to 12 months, depending on the question that we're asking. The number of people depends on the question that's being asked. And the purpose is it still safe? Because once a drug is out there, all of a sudden you're seeing a lot of other things.
In the real world.
In the real world, these are real world trials. How does it compare to other treatments? You look at different treatments that are available to see, is it cost effective to give something really expensive relative to a medicine that's quite cheap and maybe not as effective. So these are the phase 4 trials and beyond.
So I heard a lot about patient-reported outcomes in recent years, right? And it seems like there's more and more patient-reported outcome measures. What are those and why are they important?
They're so important because they say what patients feel, how they function. It's really, really important to understand what's the patient's health condition. It comes directly from patients. They answer those questions without any interpretation of the patient response by a clinician, a nurse, a doctor. This is directly patient-reported outcomes are reported by patient. There are patient-centered outcomes that sometimes are used, and that's research that's specifically designed to meet the most important needs of patients based on surveys or other research that was done. And it can come from patients, but it can also come from the providers. So that is patient-centered. Patient-reported outcomes are directly from patients.
So that's really helpful for helping us to better understand the difference and the nuance between those. What do most clinical trials measure?
So I wanted to quote Lord Kelvin, because if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. It's really, really important to have an outcome in any clinical research. So if we divide the things that are measured in clinical trials or even in observational trials, One is clinical outcomes assessment. That measures the patient's symptoms with patient-reported outcomes or the effects of a disease on how a patient functions. And that's exercise testing, for example, or other functional measure. Can you get out of a seat, for example, is a clinical outcome assessment. Biomarker is a different measurement that's taken in clinical trial, and that is an objective measure. It's evaluated as an indicator of a biological process. Disease, a blood test is a great example, and looking at the biological response to therapeutic interventions. So we talk a lot in respiratory about blood eosinophils or blood neutrophil or exhaled pheno. These are biomarkers.
Yeah, we've had so many biomarkers kind of come on the scenes over the last decade in our space, specifically of atopic and airways diseases. And, I think that specifically when we're talking about research study outcomes and the development of tools, tell us about the tools that you've worked on specifically.
Thank you. So we talked about patient-reported outcomes and clinical outcome assessments. So I wanted to mention the GAAPP. GAAPP is Chronic Airways Assessment Test, and it's 8-question questionnaire that is standardized. It's easy to administer. It's translated to many, many languages. And it's a way to measure health status of a patient and to help the patient and the clinician have a conversation on how they feel, if their treatment is working, and really use it as a disease management instrument. And we do have a webpage for the GAAPP. We're managing it. The governance board is managed by GAAPP. And we do have a webpage that explains how physicians, clinicians, and patients can use the GAAPP as a way to have a conversation about how they feel. Another tool that I wanted to mention is blood eosinophils, because that is something that in a lot of the diseases that we work with, type 2 inflammation, blood eosinophil is a measurement or a biomarker that's being used. And a specific example that I could give is that after a lot of research that we've done in big studies that I will talk about later, we recognize that there is a subset of individuals with high blood eosinophils, and it's defined as 100 to more than 300 cells per microliter, and that is used to guide inhaled corticosteroid treatment today by the GOLD committee that recommends treatment approaches. So here's a biomarker that came out of a lot of research, understanding that people respond well if they have higher blood eosinophils, and don't do that well if they're very low blood eosinophils. So that's a biomarker.
It's really incredible how far this has come in our space in such a short time. Now, thinking about those different stages of research that you talked about before, preclinical all the way through phase 4 and commercialization, how do we use outcomes in each of those phases?
That's a great question. And preclinical, the first thing that we ask using biomarkers or different outcomes is it relevant to the disease? Before I pursue a drug against a certain target, I want to understand, is this a target that is important to that particular disease? Phase 1 could use those clinical outcome assessment as a proof of pharmacology to see that the drug is working. Is it relevant to the mechanism that we're targeting with a medicine? And we often link biomarkers in animal models or in tissue culture to phase 1 outcomes in healthy people to see if something changes, if the biomarker is affected. In phase 2, we can use a biomarker that can help us select patients who might benefit from the intervention. And then in phase 2, biomarker or clinical outcome has to be relevant to patients, physicians, and regulators, because at the end of the day, the FDA, the EMA, all regulatory agencies approve the drug. When we go to phase 3 and beyond, now we're getting to payers. Now we use outcomes that matter to payers and showing that this is cost-effective. Drugs, usually when they're launched, it's a big investment for payers, insurance companies, for example, and then they have to decide, is that biomarker changing enough or clinical outcome assessment changing enough to justify its cost? So physicians, regulators, patients, and payers all get involved at that stage in saying that this outcome is important.
Well, and they're the gatekeepers, right? If a product gets approved, but it doesn't get in the hands of patients, it really only leads to frustration. We always say innovation without access leads to frustration. And so I think that's a really important point, that we change the shift and the focus of outcomes to really what matters to the different stakeholders at different times. Now, talk about how the digital space has evolved clinical trials and research.
It makes it more accessible. So when we think about clinical trials, when I started out doing clinical trials, we studied people that lived around the site of the testing. Mm-hmm. Now we have a digital ecosystem, and that could be adherence monitors that are clipped on an inhaler, biosensors like the watches that we wear, or gas exchange monitors. It could be a diary that a patient keeps at home and uses the patient-reported outcomes, like the cat that I described, to fill a diary. They don't have to go anywhere. They can just do everything at home. And then electronic health records. A lot of patients around the world have electronic data. That's the real world that we mentioned. But we can also select patients that could potentially participate in clinical trial through registries that share their electronic health records. And then with a lot of data sciences and integration and encryption to ensure privacy, we can find out if a patient took the medicine, did the markers or biomarkers of disease improve, did the patient feel better with the patient-reported outcomes, and were these changes linked to each other by time? That's cause and effect, because I mentioned at the beginning, the right medicine for the right patient, the right time is how long do you need to take something to maintain the benefit. So also, we can use a digital ecosystem to understand who didn't respond. If we started out this conversation saying that you need to dose 25 people to get one person to feel better, we need to understand who are these people that are not responding. Do they have more adverse events, or are they just not responding to the medicine? And all this can be done in the digital space without going to a clinic or doing all the measurements.
It really does open up a whole new world of who can participate in clinical trials and in research with this digital ecosystem. So as we kind of begin to wrap up our time here, what are some of the most important critical elements to clinical trials that you want our audience to know about?
Thanks. So the first thing is, in order for someone to conduct clinical research, they need to be trained in human subject research training. In 1964, those who are familiar with the Declaration of Helsinki, it provided guidance for the ethics of medical research. You can't just start studying humans without making sure that the person understands the protection of human research participants, making sure that the conduct of research doesn't harm anyone, that everybody understands that they need to be trained in order to conduct research. So you should not participate in a trial that's not conducted by somebody who is certified and trained. And there's a lot of free training available that we can provide. So in terms of the elements of clinical trial, the way it goes is you have, and patients can be a part of that all the way from the beginning, is defining the research question, understanding what type of study, are we doing a survey, are we doing an intervention? Is it the first point where researchers could really engage with patient advocates, because we don't want to design a study that doesn't matter to patients or that is too difficult for patients to complete. So designing a study that answers the questions, preparing the protocol and other documents that like study advertisements and patient consent. For new treatments, the study is submitted to regulatory authorities to see if it's safe enough. Is there enough testing to make sure that it's safe to give the drug to people? And does it answer the research question? Is it justified? A study is submitted also to ethics committee, and finding out, one, are the researchers qualified? Are they trained in research? Is the study necessary? Is there another way to do it? Participant data privacy is very, very important. That's around the world. Safety measures, and how will the data be reported and how the knowledge will be shared. Then the study starts. We recruit the participants. The study is registered in public databases that you can search and find what's relevant to you if you're interested, and the recruitment begins. And once the study is completed, it's reported and published in conferences and in journals. But one thing that is important is the late-term summary. Participants and the community has the right to understand what happened, what is the outcome of the study. And as patient advocates, we feel quite strongly that we need to share the knowledge, not just with the scientific and clinical community, but also in simple terms, webinars, infographics, and blogs explaining what was the result of the research.
Again, it's all for naught if the very people who are supposed to benefit from it can't understand what the data tells us, right? So I think that's why it is so important that we've got those plain language summaries in a very important way that GAAPP is engaging and supporting the work. Now, if people are out there and they're listening and they're saying, like, how do I get involved? How do I go about learning what clinical trials are available? And how do I start participating in clinical trials? How would you help them?
So we do have a webpage at GAAPP for different studies that we're helping recruit for, but you could find trials in your area by using registries of clinical trials like clinicaltrials.gov. We do have some instructions in the GAAPP research page on how to get there. But one thing that I want everybody to remember, to participate in a clinical trial, it is completely voluntary. When you see a trial that you're interested in, you have to understand what's the summary of research, why is the study needed, how long will it take, what will be measured, what do I need to do, any modifications, any sub-studies that could potentially be available. Make sure you understand the risks, but also the benefits of healthcare, education, participation, and if there is any financial reimbursement on participating in a study. So you can find the study, but make sure that informed consent, that you really understand what the study is, how long will it take, and what needs to be done. So that's something that we feel is quite important to mention.
So probably the most common question that we get around research is why? At the end of the day, why should I do this? Because it may or may not benefit me personally. So why participate in clinical trials or research?
Yeah, and a lot of people with chronic diseases struggle with the idea of a trial that may not help them. And one thing is, yes, you're serving the community, but hopefully the study will result in something that will help them specifically, because I know a lot of people always ask us about the placebo. What if I'm on placebo? Well, the reality is that a lot of trials, especially in late phase, you can switch from placebo to active. A lot of participants get switched in those trials. Contribution to helping other by advancing science is very, very noble, but the reality is that patients can develop relationship with the clinician by being in a clinical trial, seeing them more often, getting sometimes better care in a lot of communities where there isn't great access to care. By being in a clinical trial, there's a closer relationship with clinicians and really getting better health care. But it is important that these extensions will allow sometimes participants stay on an active drug if you know that it's really making a difference.
Absolutely. Well, Ruth, as we close today, I just want to thank you so much for your passion for patients and definitely for the way that you stand in the gap for patients by advancing research and clinical trials. It is truly inspiring to us how you've transformed this pillar and the work at GAAPP over the last year, and I look forward to what's to come in the future. So today I also want to stop and thank our listeners for tuning in and for spending the time with us here at Passion for Patients podcast. I also want to invite you to visit GAAPP.org to learn more about our research mission pillar and to get some of our free downloadable resources that you've seen displayed throughout this podcast. Finally, I don't want you to miss our next episode. That's where we are actually going to hear from Victor Gasco-Marino, again, about some of the work that he's doing with artificial intelligence. So be sure to tune in and check that out. Again, until then, stay passionate, and thanks for your time today.